Hey guys, welcome back for more tutorials. My name is Magnet, and we're going to be talking about playing the late game in Zerg versus Protoss today. And we're going to be mostly focusing on how to get to the late game safely, the types of compositions and counters that you're probably going to want to be looking out for in the late game. Namely, the fact is that you're going to need to be able to play every type of style if you want to get to the late game, because just doing only one and being able only to do one thing like Roach Hydra is not going to cut it in the late game. And the late game also is about getting a big bank and being able to clash against the Protoss army multiple times and being able to refill your forces just faster than he can get his refilled, because you just have more money and more stuff. So let's jump into the game here, and the first game we're going to be looking at is Stats versus Curious. Stats in particular is really well known for his PvZ, and he's very, very flexible. Curious isn't a name you hear all that often anymore, but he's definitely still very solid, kind of in the background a lot of the times, but he's one of the stronger Zergs out there, and especially in very unusual situations, Curious can play his way out of it, and he's also a very good late game Zerg, something that not a lot of people give him credit for. But we're going to watch this now, and by the way, this is a 2-base speed opener into a third. This is just ultra safe, and like we mentioned, getting to the late game for one thing is just getting there safely without dying and finding some sort of advantage as far as getting there. So he's going to go ahead and take a third base. This is very conservative, by the way. Zergling speed is almost done. But we all know that you do need Zergling speed or Roach Warren by the time you'd be expecting to hold off multiple, or rather most of the 2-base Protoss plays. Another thing to take into account, I'm sorry, I'll just keep going with this. Another thing to take into account is that maps like this are huge, and you're going to play the late game more often than not on huge maps. So if it's a huge map, maybe you just want to go straight into the late game because you know it's going to get there anyway. Maybe you are better than your opponents in most of the time in the late game. Bigger maps tend to favor late game plays. So what we're seeing here out of Stats right now, that he could have scouted with his Overlord really at any time, but he doesn't have an Overlord down there in time. The map size really working against him, but his Overlords are not really anywhere nearly close, so he doesn't really know for sure. But this is just a standard Phoenix into Colossus and a third base type of play from the Protoss, and you can continue to check that, and you can kind of follow the rules that we've talked about in a lot of other videos, and that is keeping your drone count fairly manageable and not going crazy on drones if they're still only on 2 bases. So right now, if you're curious, you probably don't want to keep producing anything extra unless you are sure that he's taking a third, so that's why he's looking out for it. Once they take a third base is when you can start to force getting into late game yourself, and as soon as he realizes that a third's being taken because the units are moving down, he goes ahead and just takes a fourth, and he's just going to play this out as economically as possible. Now firstly, you need some sort of tech to get you into the late game. Some sort of tech that can kind of keep the pressure on the Protoss and keep them reacting to what you're doing. And one really good tech to do that is going to be Spire. If you go for a Roach Hydra tech, that's mostly going to end the game on maybe 4 bases for you. That's usually not going to get you into the late game, and transitions out of that are a lot harder than if you open up with something like Muta first, or maybe Swarm Host first. Those are the 2 techs that are really going to lead into the late game the most smoothly. We're going to take a look at how Curious does this. This is mostly to try and keep Stats pinned in his base for as long as possible, while Curious takes the whole map and gets as much of a bank as he can. So he's got a Spire coming up here. There already are Phoenix on the way, or rather on the map, since he opened with those, but that's okay. 18 Mutas are on the way, and it's going to force him to have to produce more Phoenix, and it's going to force him to stay in his base for quite a long time. Of course, as we talked about in the Mutalist video, or have we actually talked about that yet? I don't remember, but I've done too many videos, that sometimes these Muta builds can actually just end the game early, but still, the idea with these Mutas is to force them to stay in their base for a really long time and to just take the whole map behind it. So notice that as soon as he gets his Mutalists on the map, he starts to support his Mutalists with something that's going to help out. And in this case, it's Corruptors against Phoenix count. And he's taking a 5th base immediately as soon as he moves out on the map. So, like I've been saying, the whole idea here is just to put Protoss at a point where you start to dictate their unit composition, and while they're waiting back in their main, while they're trying to not die from it, you just take the whole map. So Stats, of course, is going to have to react to this. He's adding on another Stargate here. The Mutalists are still fighting the Phoenix just a little bit. Might actually get this Nexus because there were so few Phoenix here initially. Even going to pick off some Void Rays, so this is really good for Curious. And this is the idea with Muto builds, is that a lot of times you'll catch them with unit compositions that aren't that great against it, and you can deal some damage, but you will need to be ready to switch out of it eventually. Once these fringe bases are up and mining, you really want to mine gas from them immediately. The minerals don't matter as much. It's really just the gas, and then keeping them protected with spines and spores and stuff is also very, very important. But throughout most of this game, let's note that stats is basically going to be confined to this small little area for the whole game if possible. Maybe he'll secure a 4th base, but the idea is that by the time he's able to secure a 4th, he's going to have to start getting adventurous out on the map, or else he's going to get crushed by your responses. So what we really need to talk about is countering Protoss' tech in the late game. So right now, the Mutalisks have forced out these Phoenix. And then you can start to decide, well, what does well against Phoenix? And one thing that does well against Phoenix are these Corruptors. But eventually he's going to get enough Phoenix to be able to kill both of them. So you need to start thinking about, if he has 30 Phoenix and they have +2 attack or something. By the way, here's a decent attack here, but it's mostly just to try to keep him in his base. So let's say he has 30 Phoenix and they're all +2 attack. Then your move from there would probably be something like Infestors, because if you can fungal the Phoenix, then they all die really easily to the Corruptor and Mutifier, and that's the end of that. Or you could go for something like Ultralisk, just saying that, well, if he's on this many Phoenix, then he won't have anything to respond to my Ultralisk very well, and I can just plow through him that way. The other side could be maybe he's on a lot of Phoenix, and he doesn't have that many Colossus, but in this case he does. And you could transition into something like Swarmhost that'll punish the lack of Colossus on the field. You need to be considering that once I get to this stage of the game, not only is it important to take all these bases and secure them with spines and spores and stuff, and get a huge bank going, as we can see him getting started, but it's also about putting Protoss in a position where they need to be able to wildly change their unit composition at a moment's notice. So here comes the Infestation Pit. This could just be for Hive, but we'll have to see if it's going to be for Infestors or Swarm Hosts as well. But the whole time, he's just been trying to keep Protoss in his base through this various amounts of harassment. Look how many Phoenix are on the field right now. And this is where you'd have to start thinking, like, my Mutas are probably going to start getting diminishing returns because there's so many Phoenix here. You can still do okay with this many Corruptors, but the idea is that I need to switch into a composition that's going to do well against stuff he's going to change into, or rather against what he has on the field. So if he keeps producing Phoenix, then I can't just keep making Mutas and die to that. Even still, he's doing really well with these Corruptors because he's able to counter the relatively small amount of Phoenix that aren't that upgraded. Here comes the counterattack on the other side, and this is why you need these spines to help buy time, maybe pick off a couple of units, and of course the creep spread to be able to see this stuff coming across the map. Stats starts to realize that Curious will probably have enough stuff back at home, or at least be able to fly his Mutas back to deal with this. It's probably not going to work out too well. So he's just playing a very counterattacky style and trying to keep stats contained the entire time. He did get a 4th base up and rolling, but once again, it's up to you to continue to take the whole map with extra bases here and there, protect them with spines and spores, and continue to build your bank so that you can counter their unit composition once it gets to a certain point. So again, more Muta harass here, just trying to deal as much damage as they can, because the Mutas are only going to get worse and worse as the Phoenix count rises. Of course, if you can get the Phoenix killed off with Corruptors and whatnot, that'll be great. But Curious really just staying on this style for quite a long time, and you can stay on this for quite a while, but you will eventually need a transition out of it. He should be mining gas from the space, by the way, so he has a decent amount of gas production. If you take a look at the income, if you can get these numbers about equalized on maybe about 1,400 each, that's going to be great. And notice his extremely high drone count, 84, just so he's able to keep mining as much as he can. And he doesn't have a huge army, and the whole idea is just to counter it as efficiently as possible. So now this is the point where the Mutalisks start to die, and you need to be at the point where eventually a good Protoss is going to find a way to deal with these Mutas. You won't usually be able to just win the game only on the Mutas. And it's up to you to have built up enough of a bank, because you'll have been mining on extra bases for so much longer, to be able to switch into whatever you want. So if there's this much stuff, if there's Phoenix, a couple Colossus, and this many Stalkers, we need to start thinking, alright, what's going to do well against this? And there's a lot of different avenues you can go towards. I personally would go for Infestor Ling would not be bad against this few of Colossus. Ultralisk would be really good against this, because Stalkers are actually really bad against those. If there's like 6 to 8 Ultras and you have support for them, like Zerglings and whatnot. So you need to be able to look at their unit composition and decide, what's going to really do well against this. And you need to be able to counter that as your army starts to die, because it's going to happen eventually. So Curious' entire army dies. He's refilling on a lot of Corruptors, a lot of Zerglings, and some Infestors. So his choice is going to be an Infestorling along with these Corruptors to help kill the Colossus. So if he can kill the Colossus here, then Infestorling is going to rip up the rest of the army pretty easily. So Stats starting to counterattack here. This can be a little bit of a concern. He's starting up his Greater Spire and an Ultralisk Cavern at the same time so that he can react properly. And the idea here is that maybe he can force out 3 or 4 more Colossus with this Infestorling style and then switch into Broodlords and crush it that way. So there's a lot of different ways you need to be thinking about what counters Protoss tech, and more importantly, having the money to be able to do stuff like that is very, very important. So a little bit of a Ling counterattack here. This usually isn't going to do too much. Fortunately, he actually did get this 4th base here, so Stats mining is actually really bad. But the transition after this Zergling stage is going to be what's really important. And you can't afford to throw Zerglings away at this point because the gas is what's most important. And either way, if it's Ultras or if it's Broodlords, those are both going to be really good choices against the type of army composition that Stats has right now. Probably less so Broodlords. I would say more so Ultras are going to be better. And we'll have to see what he chooses between the two of those. Of course, these are late game videos. They will be pretty long videos, and we do have one more to look at that opens up in a slightly different way. But this will be a good way to at least to check out an alternate way as far as how to get to the end of the late game and kind of survive. Like I was talking about, Ultralisks are a good choice against this type of army composition. That's exactly what we're going to see come down here. Really what you need to watch out for with Ultras is a high Immortal count, but if it's just Stalkers and Colossus, then with Fungals and the Stalkers are able to blink away, you can just run over armies like this. It's actually really, really funny how fast it dies a lot of the time, especially if you have Corruptors to help out as far as killing the Colossus or throwing down Corruption on top of different units such as Archons or whatever. A lot of different areas as far as getting a good advantage with this. And you can see he's back to max out. You want to be sitting at max out with a big bank as much as possible, and taking these extra bases earlier rather than later is going to be strong as far as getting you to that point. Dumping more Zerglings here, realizing that those aren't going to do anything against this high Colossus and Archon count, so might as well just switch them out for something else. His choice is going to be adding in Broodlords as well. So he's really giving him no right opportunities here. If he makes Immortals to counter the Broodlords, or rather to counter the Ultralisks, then the Broodlords kill everything. If he makes units to counter the Broodlords, such as Tempest, and that's a lot less to deal with his Ultras. So you want to eventually get to a point where you give them no right decisions. They can't attack because there's too many spines here. Notice the huge amount of spines and spores. And you give them no army composition that's going to really do well against what you have. So we're eventually going to see Curious attack across the map with this composition, be able to tear down Stats' army, because he just doesn't have the income to make the right units to deal with this. You'll notice he realizes that Ultras were on the way, so he starts Immortals desperately, but it's like, LOL, now the Broodlords are even stronger. And especially with the Fungals, if you can keep the Broodlords protected away from Stalkers and stuff like that, then there's just not a whole lot the Protoss can do to respond. So we're just going to watch Curious kill Stats here really fast, and then we'll go on to the next replay in the very near future. It's exactly what I'm talking about, that Stats realizes, oh man, I really need to react to these Ultras, I really need to deal with these Ultras, because he thinks it's just only Ultra Corruptor. But in fact, the Broodlords behind it are going to be what seals the deal. And the most important part was just that Curious had the money here, and Stats for the most part didn't. And now he's starting to realize that this might be a threat, as he's starting to bring out High Templar to feedback Infestors and Queens and stuff, but he sees the army composition, he's like, oh no, now I need to deal with Broodlords, and I need to get all that stuff out. So he starts to produce Tempest, but you need to stay aggressive and stay on top of him, not give him too much of an opportunity. I feel like Curious is actually sitting around a little bit too long. He's being a little stubborn as far as bringing Queens with his army, which can be good, but if it's going to slow down your attack by a couple minutes, there's no reason to really do that. So Curious is going to come in here, going to try to engage Stats' army the best he can. Note that because of Curious's constant aggression, Stats is basically reduced to 1 base's mining. Here's one here, about half a base. Here's another about half a base, and here's a fully mining base. So we can basically say 2 bases versus Curious having about 3+ bases on the other side. And we'll eventually see Stats die to this, because he just doesn't really have a good answer for the Broodlords. Also, you need to be making sure that your units are getting the right connections here. So if there's Tempest on the fields trying to hit your Broodlords, you definitely need to come forward with your Corruptors and attack these Tempests and get them out of the way. If you have Vipers, you can pull the Vipers into the Corruptors, and that'll be a good way so you don't have to engage over top of their Archons or Storms or anything. So you just definitely need to make sure that everything is doing its job in these types of battles. Here's a fungal on the army, just general fungal usage, just throw it down on whatever you can. The Ultralists basically die for nothing, but that's okay because the Broodlords are still standing strong right now. And most importantly, look at the bank that he has to remax with. He can remax on whatever he wants, and LOL, 39 mutas right out of the gate, only because he has the money to do this. And even if he was able to hold off against that, these Immortals are terrible against Mutalisks. There's a Tempest, which isn't going to do anything. There's only a handful of Stalkers. And how is he possibly going to deal with this many mutas? The mutas could just take pretty much whatever fight they want, as long as they don't fly over the Archons. And it's just constantly switching back and forth between various unit compositions. It's going to give you a big advantage. This is so funny. He just lost his entire army, but he just repopulates with this big muta cloud. Honestly, he should be a little bit more aggressive about taking extra bases here and having more gas mining, just so he can make these switches a little bit harder and a little bit faster. But yeah, so he finally starts to engage here. His upgrades are so good on his Mutalist, 3-3, he can just magic box these Archons, but there's just not enough here to possibly deal this much damage to the air army of Curious. He loses basically nothing in that. You know, 8 mutas, you might say, yeah, that's a lot, but he killed the entire Protoss army, and that's just effectively going to end the game. So these wild changes, these wild economic leads are going to go a long way for you, and I really especially love how many spines and spores Curious puts down to protect himself from counterattacks. So this is a great game played out by Curious, and Stats is basically dead, so there's not much of a reason to continue to watching this game. So let's take a look quickly at one more. I kind of want to show you another way you can enter the late game, and we'll play most of this on fast forward just because I know these videos can get a little bit long and exhausting, but it's a video about late game and you're going to be playing long and exhausting games anyway, so that's to be expected. Let's take a look at Whelmu versus Starbuck here. This game, I believe, I'm almost 100% sure, it starts out with Swarm Hosts. And Swarm Hosts are a good way to get yourself entered into the late game. You can see this is a 40-minute game. But Swarm Hosts, if you're good at turtling and you're good at just playing out slower games and protecting yourself, then Swarm Hosts are a good way to play out a game in which you just starve the Protoss opponent because they just can't get the unit composition up that they need. And it's really all up to you to play defensively. So last game was sort of an aggressive way to get to late game and kind of survive the late game with constant tech switches. This is a much more defensive way to do that. So we're going to see Starbuck open up hatch first. A tad greedy, but sometimes you can get away with it. Gas and then immediate spawning pool. So this looks like another pretty fast circling speed type of build. Not much else really makes too much sense here. So as soon as he gets 100 gas, he stops mining it, at least fully. Mines with 1 drone. Going to take a third base here eventually. This is another pretty slow third. I guess I should say that this is a very safe way to enter the late game if you want to take a little bit slower third base and get Zergling speed up instead. We've talked a little bit about the faster the third, the better, and that's true most of the time, but these players just have a little bit of a different style. It won't ultimately change a whole lot, but he just needs to be able to stop any big gateway attacks that might try to hit him before he has everything established. And then of course, once he understands that Protoss has a third base, then he can start playing a little bit more aggressively as far as transitioning into the later parts of the game, getting more drones, stuff like that. Now, excuse me. Now he realizes that a third base is down, so he can start adding drones here pretty liberally. He's also adding Hydras just to maybe be able to push off any sort of fake third base cancel or anything like that. But once it's assuredly finished, he can definitely run in there and check that out with these Zerglings. So he knows for sure. He should be able to start adding on drones here, take an extra base like we talked about from last game, and start getting into those later parts of the game. Once they take a third base is when you can really start up Swarm Hosts, which we talked about in the Swarm Host video. But this is just really all about keeping the Swarm Host protected and just staying in your base and playing out a super long game and just trying to whittle him down by way of him not being able to deal with the Swarm Host effectively. So he opened up with Hydra Ling, which is an opener I really like because it shuts down a lot of these really random gateway timings and especially these blink timings even after a third base. So he should be doing just fine with these Hydralisks and with these Zerglings. And the Swarm Host will just continue to add on to how effective this is going to be throughout the game. So Swarm Hosts are now out, spewing Locusts a little bit. And the whole point is eventually to get Locusts hitting his bases, so he has to stay back in his base. You can use them defensively if they're being super aggressive and just make sure you're moving your Swarm Hosts away from where their attacks are coming from and just rallying Locusts forward. It's going to take a little bit of practice. The Hive's coming up now. And this time I think, and I'm pretty sure, we're going to see more Viper inclusion. Considering late game, as far as Viper being used, is very, very strong. Another attack coming from a different angle this time. You can just rally forward your Swarm Host the best you can. use your support, whether it's Hydralisk or Zerglings that you might have had earlier in the game, to keep you alive for these types of attacks. Colossus are on the way now, which is a natural counter to these Swarm Hosts. And you can play this out a little bit differently than what Starbuck is doing as well. Like we mentioned, still not a whole lot going on. There are some drones and stuff being killed, but we really want to focus on when it starts to actually enter the later parts of the game. Whelmy's just being annoying right now. He shouldn't be able to break Starbuck by any means. So, what I was going to mention is that we talked about mutas getting you into the late game by way of pinning them in their base. We're talking now about Swarm Hosts being a good way by just defending their attacks for a really long time. But also, since you know that the counter to Swarm Hosts is going to be a lot of Colossus, you can abuse those transitions as well. So if they have a lot of Colossus out and you're able to get extra bases up in mining, then you can start thinking about things like muted transitions, maybe ultraless transitions, stuff like that. And you always need to keep that in mind as far as if I lose my Swarm Host, or if I really want to abuse their tech, then I can switch that way. But if you want to play out these much more turtley Swarm Host styles, then you definitely can. You do need to be aware that counterattacks are definitely a thing, especially when people are trying to break Swarm Hosts. So static defenses at your extra bases are really necessary, like we saw from Curious last game. I don't think Starbuck is going to be quite as on top of that, because as a whole, Curious is really a better player than Starbuck in many ways, but that's mostly just Curious's familiarity with the late game as far as adding on all those extra defensive structures and not being picked apart. So still, we're getting into the late game where Starbuck is actually having a pretty hard time. Whelmy's doing a good job as far as multi-pronging him and dealing with the Infestor, or rather the Swarm Host, pretty well. But as long as you just stay alive and don't lose anything, then this is a way you can enter the late game. The Protoss will be furiously mining and furiously, hopefully, losing units to your Locust. And then all of a sudden it'll be to the point where they kind of mine out and there's not really a whole lot of options they have. Like I said, this is a 40-minute game, and I don't know if we're going to watch the whole thing, but we just need to explore the general idea of kind of turtling it out with Swarm Hosts and getting to the late game that way. So, killing Zealots for free, another attack's going to get on top of his Swarm Hosts here, but there's just too many Locusts. He should have been more willing to unburrow his Swarm Hosts and move back just a little bit too. But the inclusion of Vipers is also going to be a big thing that we need to look at here. Mostly that you're going to get good trades with your Locusts if you can just pull stuff into the Locust with the Vipers. So we're going to watch that kind of develop as time goes on. Of course, you do need to be careful of things like feedback so you don't lose your Vipers right away. But the idea here is just that Starbuck is just trying to hold down territory for as long as he can and trying to force Whelmy to make a mistake, and eventually he can start pushing out on the map a little bit more with creep spread and start to take more territory that way, as well as static defenses. Here's the Spire coming up right now, so a big switch into Mulus could be a thing. You could also switch into Corruptors to help support the Swarm Host a little better. So seeing another attack come up here, and yeah, it looks like Starbuck is having a bit of a hard time right now. He's still not losing any units though. He's losing things like Hydralisk. He pulls the Mothership Core in, and he's losing, you know, Spines and Spores and a base every once in a while. But as long as he keeps his units alive, the Protoss still has to eventually find a way to deal with those units. And here's another pull on the Colossus just to pull it back into the Hydras and the Locusts. Another pull on a Colossus back into the Locusts. And if you're countering Colossus with your Swarm Hosts, and that's pretty LOL because Colossus are supposed to be good against Swarm Hosts. So the Vipers definitely do have utility, and once again he lost his base, but he's still fine. So we're going to continue to see this play out for quite a while and watch a lot of this game on pretty fast speed. I'm going to get fairly bad frame rates because I am recording and playing at the same time on pretty high settings, so those are all things that might not make this too pleasant, but when we continue to attack in here, more defenses set up here as far as static defenses, Locust rallying forward. You can use Blinding Clouds if you need to. Eventually you will need to find a way to deal with these Colossus, because if you just let them make 8 Colossus without any repercussions, then that's kind of bad. So things like more Vipers, things like Corruptors maybe you can mix in there, can also be really good transitions. Here's the Spire researching +1 as well, and upgrades all spinning as well, so he's doing a good job. And eventually it's going to get to the point where you have to start dealing with big Protoss air fleets. And that's where the Corruptors start to come in. You can't afford to just keep staying on everything else and kind of just, you know, half-ass your way through everything. You need to eventually commit to something that's going to counter what he brings out. Corruptors and Vipers and stuff in the late game are definitely where you want to go. Notice the huge amount of static defenses here. He has a lot of spines. Eventually you're going to want to add spores, because if you can pull things like carriers or tempests into spore crawlers, that's an amazing trade for you. More pulls on Colossus so that the Locust can kill it. And these Vipers are doing so much work. He just killed off, I think, 4 Colossus basically for free. He spent Viper energy to kill that, and the Locust eventually tore him down. So, yeah, just continued trades like this are things you definitely want to eventually start to focus on. Notice the huge amount of static defenses here to defend against Warp Prism counterattacks. But eventually you're going to get to a point where, like I said, you have to defend massive Protoss fleets. There's already 5 Stargates going to be on the map here in just a second. And 5 Stargates at a time means 5 carriers at a time, 5 Void Rays at a time, 5 Tempests at a time. So you need to be able to get into the right units to counter that. And most of the time it's a lot of Corruptors, but it's also, like I said, these Spores and Vipers. So you can pull stuff into the Spores and pull stuff into the Corruptors. And that'll all eventually get really, really better and better trades for you. Notice that he still doesn't even have a 5th base here, because he's just sitting there and he's being very defensive, and he's eventually going to take a 5th base once he can get his creep down there and eventually clear out all this stuff. But you don't need to go wild with expanding if you're going to be a defensive Zerg and you're going to play that way. Here's the big Void Array count, by the way. And something you can also kind of pepper in there to help out is Infestors, because Fungal Growth is really good against big clumps of units, and Void Rays as a whole tend to clump really hard. You can also fungal things like Interceptors if they go for a lot of carriers. Against Tempests, though, they're really not that great. So we're getting into the super, super late stages of the game. As you can see, he's still just sitting in one spot, continuing to add on static defenses here, and it takes so much money and effort from Protoss to break something like this that's what your victory condition is them just kind of throwing away units into your army, and eventually you being able to mine them out as the game goes longer and longer. So this base is going to be hard for Whelmu to get, this is going to be hard for him to get. Starbuck still has this base that he can take at pretty much any point, and because Whelmu's been mining harder and for longer on these bases, it's going to be, he's going to mine out first, and Starbuck will eventually get him to a point where he has no money and no army. So this can be an extremely long and arduous process, but a lot of people do like to play this way. Another little bit of harassment, you get any lost drones. Okay, whatever, I'll just refill my drones, not a big deal. As long as I'm keeping my bank up here. And Swarm Hosts are another great way to keep your bank up, considering you can get to points where you're just not losing any units. Take a look at the units lost here. Protoss has lost a lot more, and that's why this huge bank exists for Starbuck right now. So yeah, this game goes on for quite a while in the same manner. I want to eventually get to the point where Whelmu doesn't really have any more options left, and you can see that the turtling it out eventually does have a win condition. But he definitely will need to eventually clear out this base. You can see him bringing Overseers down here. He realizes there's DTs and whatnot, so he can fungal these and kill them with Hydras and whatnot. Here come the carriers now, and those are definitely going to be a big concern, because fully upgraded carriers are extremely terrifying. But the best thing against those is just huge amounts of Spore Crawlers and using your Vipers to pull the carriers in and die to these Spore Crawlers. Honestly, a unit that takes almost 3 minutes to produce that dies to a couple of Spore Crawlers is the most infuriating thing ever as Protoss. And that can be, that's definitely the best way to do this. Going to definitely make a lot of Protosses mad by doing that. Also, the Mothership is something that can come out in the late game against Protoss, so you will need a lot of detection, so 3 or 4 Overseers is not uncommon in your army by this stage of the game, but still, Starbuck is just saying, I'm okay with just sitting here for this long. It's up to you to come and have to push out on the map and start to take more forward positions if you really want to do anything. If you do that, then my Locust will be within rallying range, and you're going to have a harder and harder time doing that. So that's kind of the idea here. Kind of a weird fungal growth. I don't know what that Infestor was doing, but yeah. So once you start to claim this territory, as far as with spines and stuff, you can start pushing forward a little bit more towards the Protoss base. So you'll notice he's rerouting his Swarm Hosts over here. He's moving some spines over so that he has multiple attack fronts. And like I said, it's going to be hard for Whelmu to get these expansions as the game goes on. Here's the inclusion of Corruptors to start responding to Whelmu's force. The cloak on the Mothership is going to be really, really good as far as killing Locusts and whatnot, but you can reveal them with Fungals, you can reveal them with Overseers, or you could also just pull the Mothership in and kill that with your Corruptors and with your Spores and whatever else. There he goes pulling the Mothership right now. So you can still just peel this apart with Vipers, and that's really going to be the whole idea. And with this many spines, Spores, Infestors, Vipers, all this stuff, it's going to take Protoss forever to get through this, And at any point, if at any point he loses this army, he can free flood with like 40 Mutalisks, and there's no way this army is going to be able to kill 40 Mutalisks that are well upgraded. So it's again just eliminating the amount of options that are viable for Protoss. And in this game, it was much more about starving him out and making him attack into a position that's really bad for him. So more Fungals come down. Void Rays and Carriers being killed by Spore Crawlers. You can see Hydralisks doing their job here. A couple of Corruptors peppered in. But this is just so infuriating as a Protoss to try and deal with this. And by the way, let's look at Wellmu's army now. LOL, it's like 6 units, and he has barely any money back at home. He's rebuilding a lot of stuff, of course, but Starbuck could absorb attacks like this all day, and that's usually how this is going to break down. So let's go ahead and call it good here. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you at least have some good ideas as far as how to take Protoss apart in the late game, whether it's through really aggressive tech or whether it's through very defensive tech. So if you have any questions, post them down in the comments. There's a lot more tutorials on Zerg down in the description of the video, so look out for that. But I will see you guys very soon with more, so take care.